All right, everybody, here we go. You could just give me a good thumbs up that you can hear me and see me okay. Starting like a minute early, maybe even 30 seconds. Everybody hear me all right? See me okay? Hi, guys. Awesome. Awesome. All right. Yeah, I'm really nervous about doing this one today because it's the first time I'm using the encoder. Those of you who are not YouTubers won't know what I'm talking about necessarily, but YouTube has built-in features and functions to stream right from YouTube, or you can use a third-party software encoder, and I'm trying that today. So, man, I kind of sweated over this one because it hasn't worked for me in the past. So hopefully that's working today. And in fact, I can do cool stuff like I can fade to my art, I can fade to an inset, I can fade back to my glorious noggin here. So that's why I'm trying the encoder. And if this live episode blows up, you'll know why. So, oh boy, everybody is chiming in now. It's always so cool to see where you guys are from. Give me a second while I look, because it's just fascinating. I'm your spirit animal, huh? Well, I can be an animal sometimes, not the good kind. Oslo, Norway. Wow. Singapore. Nice. Netherlands. It's just unbelievable. This always floors me, and you know, that I can be talking to people from around the world. I tried not to do a night broadcast this time because of that. That puts you guys kind of in the middle of the night. So really neat. Okay, so it looks like the software is working. It looks like the stream is working. And what I wanted to start out with was a few shout outs. Let me just go to this view. Just some things of interest that you might be interested in, and I wanted to show you. First of all, let me give a shout out to wet paint. Those of you who watched my broadcast before are familiar with wet paint, especially the ones with Marty. Marty lives up there in the St. Paul, Minneapolis area where wet paint is located, and they sent me a 3-color Schminke sample set of these precious stone colors. This is apparently very new for them. So a shout out to them. Thanks to them for doing that. I did swatch them out, and let's see. Let me just tell you the colors first. Well, here, I've actually swatched them out, so let's look at them. So the 3 in this set, and as far as I know, these are the only semi-precious stone paints they've produced. Those of you who are really familiar with Daniel Smith will know what these are, because Daniel Smith has a bunch of them. The Primatex mainly. But lapis lazuli, red opalite, and green porphyry. Looks like that's the way you pronounce it. I was excited to receive these. I was a little less excited after I swatched them. I think they have some uses, but I want to just show you, compared to Daniel Smith here. This is the Primatex set. Sorry, I'm trying to get my field of view right here. Let me just go to the full screen. The Schmincke colors were really weak. Now that's not unusual for semi-precious stone paints. And that's, by the way, that's the way they used to make paint, in case you're not familiar. Oh, click off autofocus? Yeah, hold on. Hold on. Actually, did not have that software open. Autofocus. La 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 la. Well, I know it's here because I've actually played with it before, but I'm not seeing it right off the bat. Oh, hold on. Focus. Auto off. There we go. Now I have the focus set for my art surface, so hopefully that works. Val, let me know if that did not do the trick. And thanks for that heads up. Okay, so back to the paints. Semi-precious stones. Schmincke is getting into it. They started with this little 3-color set. If you want to pick it up, you can get it at Wet Paint. After this show is over, I'll put a link down below. A little bit disappointed. Just they were very weak compared to the Primatex, which Daniel Smith does. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Where I saw this being the most useful was in very subtle glazes. All semi-precious stone paints are subtle, so that's the thing. You don't get the brilliant colors you get in the synthetically produced pigments that most colors are. But it's just kind of a neat thing. The semi-precious stone paints use actual ground pigment. They're extremely light fast. That's one of the reasons they were used in the past, the reason people like them today. They're high granulating, which is kind of cool. I love granulation. I love the way the Daniel Smith ones granulate. These do too. The red opalite in the Schmincke was extremely weak. And these I swatched like right out of the tube. So, and the red opalite was coarsely ground. That seems to me like it might be a decent special effect paint, because it's like throwing sand in your painting. Some people do that as a special effect for watercolor. So anyway, I was real excited to get lapis lazuli. Lapis lazuli is the original ultramarine. I'm pretty sure I got that correct. Until they learned how to synthetically produce ultramarine, that's what they used. And just some beautiful granulation there. But the color again was weak compared to the Primatex. This is not all the Primatex either. They have several more. So just wanted to do that quick little show and tell. And thanks again, Wet Paint, for sending that to me so I could try them out. I appreciate it very much. Another shout out, one of my viewers, Michelle, I see you're here. You're here, Michelle Heron, who is in the chat. Look at this. I mean, look at this. She is learning how to case bind, and this was one of her learning projects. And she very generously and graciously sent this to me. I couldn't believe it. I mean, just look at this. She was worried, that it had imperfections. I mean, how do you learn how to do this unless you do it, right? So I love it. I love all the little imperfections. But this is real case bound Arches watercolor paper. Look at these end papers. And it's all hand sewn. And case bound. Anyway, I just wanted to give her a shout out, and I'm so glad she's here to hear that live. I haven't used it yet, but I'm excited to. If it's got Arches paper in it, you know that I will. And I just love everything about it, the little imperfections included, because it just looks like something rare. Okay. All right, another quick shout out before we get into the meat of things. These journals, and we talked about papers and journals, and when I started this channel, here, let me get my inset back in here. I feel maybe a little more personal. When I started my channel, I started picking up watercolor sketchbooks, which primarily up to starting this channel is almost 4 years now. It'll be 4 years in a couple months. I didn't do a lot of plein air, and if I did plein air, if I did it, I used watercolor blocks to go outside, but I hadn't done it in a long time. Most of my painting was studio painting, so I started trying different sketchbooks, which threw me down into the lower quality paper, and I've tried a bunch of them. Some of them I like better than others. You can paint on low quality paper. You've seen my episodes and my rants and all of my talk about that. I'm not going to go into that again, but after about 3 years of trying them and deciding, I think I'm just going to try to go back. And when Erwin Leon sent me, when I bought a couple of the Perfect Sketchbooks from Erwin Leon, I realized, you know, I can do this. I can find watercolor sketchbooks that are 100% cotton. So it's not easy, but they're definitely not as plentiful. But I started trying to do that, and this is one that I want to give you as a shout out. This is a couple. The guy's name is Randolph. He goes by Rand. He makes these Arches field books. Actually, this is an Arches field book. This is a Fabriano Artistico field book, and he sells them on eBay. He and his wife put these together. I've not only bought these from him, but I've traded some comments with him in email, and he does a really good job. For all practical purposes, they're the same quality of the Arches field books that they used to sell, which you just can't seem to get anymore. That's the Fabriano. This is the Arches. This is it's a hard bound card, very thick card. He sells it in 3 colors. The most recent plein air episode I did was done in this book, and it's just Arches 140 pound. That's a ballpoint pen drawing I did at the conservatory, and I'm going to color that. But I mean, for all practical purposes, these are Arches field books. So I have already put this link in a couple of past videos, especially the ones about paper, but I will also add it to this video later when this one's up. So if you want to, you know, somebody wants to run check it right now on eBay, he is Ran, R-A-N, all lowercase, R-A-N 2424, Ran 2424. Hey Denise, thanks for coming. All right, so hopefully that helped you guys out. Oh, and by the way, they're really reasonable. There are some other people doing this on Etsy, and I've not tried any of those. Maybe, you know, they do a pretty good job too, but I know he does, and I know this is something he wants to do, at least ongoing. So enough said about that. All right, we're a little too early in the game here for questions. I haven't even gotten into the meat of this thing yet, so let's do that. Alright, so this was going to be about trees, and actually and tree foliage. And I've only done, I've done several paintings with trees. So anytime I do a painting about trees and tree foliage, there are usually tips and techniques you can pick up on those. But a dedicated video, I think I've only done maybe 2 or 3 where I'm just showing techniques. And there's one particular concept I want to get across, and I've mentioned in other videos today, and that's learning to break a tree down and visualize it. So let me start out just by saying this, and I'm going to probably punch some buttons on this one, but just go to Art View. This is what everybody starts out doing with trees, including myself. And I'm just going to do a bow of a tree, right? La da 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 da. I'm hoping my obnoxious singing will make this process seem equally obnoxious. Da 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 da. Now, as far as it goes, there's nothing wrong with that, all right? But people who start out this way, and this is what they do, and this is all they do when that's a tree limb, in case you can't tell. There may be a branch or something coming up or going through it or something, Alright, so a tree limb. The infamous stippling process, okay? Everybody does it. I've done it. Some people use sponges. That's what you see. You see a leaf, and that's what you paint. But for the purposes of this lesson, I want you to put that idea away. Just totally put it away. Just pretend that you're not allowed to do that. If you want to follow this lesson. By the way, you hear that sound? That's my chair. Sorry about that. My old chair had the same sound. I thought the new one would get rid of it, but I don't have some crazy animal walking around making squawking noises. That's my chair, so I apologize. Anyway, well, back to the lesson. So what we want to focus on are value shapes, and I tell you, I don't know how to stress this. If you focus on this aspect of painting trees, your trees and foliage and underbrush and the painting thereof will improve tenfold. I promise you. You need to start looking at trees in terms of value shapes. You can do this kind of thing later, but what it does is it takes your brain and your mind out of the idea that a tree has form. And a tree has form and volume. So important. And even though like this may be a distant view of a tree, it doesn't matter if you're close in on a limb or if you're only seeing part of a tree. A tree has form and volume. And if you really want to improve your trees, that's the mindset you need to start taking. So my goal today is to try to help you visualize value shapes. And really, this is an important art principle in general. It's something that will help you if you're painting portraits, if you're painting still lifes, if you're painting, florals, if you're painting animals. It really doesn't matter. Value shapes are what you're looking for. And and I'm going to show you what that means. So a value shape, well, first let's back up and talk about complexity. And this is what throws people excuse me. So all right, so Don, you're probably not watching, but I got an email from a gentleman named Don, and that sort of he kindly pointed out that I've never done really an episode about how to simplify photos, and I know several of you have asked, and I chose to do it about trees because that is the prime #1 candidate for simplifying and editing content from a photo. But just look how complex that is, and it's just overwhelming. You know, so developing artists, beginners, even intermediate painters, I've done it many times, see all of this texture, and that's what they want to paint. You know, and if I really want to make that tree, this is the thinking, if I really want to make that tree look detailed, I'm going to do that, right? I'm going to go in here and I'm going to do this. And it doesn't matter how far away that tree is, this is what I'm going to do. Now there's a place for this, but I'm getting to that, alright? So, what are we talking about? Here's another one. I have less contrast in this photo, but I mean, look at this tree and the complexity of it. It's just, it's overwhelming, and photos tend to do that to you. It's, and I am talking about painting from photos. These are the type of photos I very often use as reference. And the email discussion I got into with Don was, how do you decide what to leave out? Now, he specifically had a scene that he had photographed, and he wanted to recreate that scene. So he had a scene. He wasn't using his reference the way I'm using these, which are like ingredients. But generally, you want to use photo reference like a cabinet of ingredients. You know, pick and choose, and then simplify. And his question to me was, how do I know what to leave? How do you decide what to leave out? Well, that it would be a difficult lesson to have, and it's one of the reasons I've resisted, because that's what makes art art. That's the subjective part, is what to leave out. But I can give you some pointers on how to think in terms of value shapes and simplicity. Shapes within this tree. Well, first of all, you have overall shapes, and those of you who have seen my past tree episodes probably remember this. A tree usually has an overall shape, so the first thing you want to do is you don't want to be generic with your trees. You don't have to go out and find, you know, the genus and the species, and you don't have to do any of that. You just need to know that there are different outer shapes. But in addition to outer shapes, there are interior structures. We see them here, and so all of these little highlight areas are internal structures, and they create shapes. One of the easiest ways to see those shapes is to squint. Try to take your eye out of the focus on the detail and see these value shapes. This requires you painting from good photo reference or life, not out of your head. Doing this is very difficult to do out of your head. But the more you do it from good reference, the more you'll be able to then be inventive and then paint trees out of your head eventually, because you've seen enough of them. So let me talk about that further. And one of the ways I like to start seeing shapes, and I look at the highlights first. That's point one. I look at the highlights, and that's a value shape. I have an overall shape to my tree, which for this tree, you know, it's sort of a like this, right? Sort of a spread out kind of shape. And you have an overall shape, but then within that shape you've got structures that you need to start looking for and seeing. And those shapes are produced by value. So pick out the highlights first. And what I like to do is characterize those shapes. A lot of times in trees like this, characterized by saying, what does that look like? You know, that's not a tree. I see umbrellas. Okay. I see umbrellas of different size. Some of them are little. Some of them are overlapping. These are the shapes I see the highlights making. Right? Another one is clouds. I see a lot of clouds in trees. So let's get a little more paint here. You may have something that looks like that. It's a little flatter maybe on the bottom. And clouds come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. Again, if you're confused about what shapes I'm talking about the value shapes. Values are, the three main categories are highlight, midtones, and values. And all of those value ranges create shapes. And you want to start training your eye to see those shapes. And the place to start is the highlights. This, I just can't stress enough, this will revolutionize your painting and painting of trees. So maybe you have some umbrellas, maybe you have, and you know, sometimes out towards the edge, you need to study trees. Sometimes out towards the edge, it looks like the umbrellas are turning downward, and they're all just sort of, it's like somebody has a bouquet of umbrellas of different size. Another one, very typical with conifer trees, are boats, boat shapes. So you'll see those a lot. And these names are not important, it's just what I see, you know. It's like laying on the grass and picking out shapes out of clouds. You know, if it looks like something else to you, but I try to look at all the shapes and I say they all kind of look like, you know, this or that. Another one I see a lot are, hold on, get some more paint here, fingers. And yes, all of these shapes are irregular. I see fingers on a lot of trees radiating out from a center. And again, I'm talking about the most highlighted boughs. Okay? Some of the fingers will be very pointy. Some of them will be, you know, long and even, and they'll get shorter as you get to the top. These are shapes. These are shapes that delineate value. From there, usually you start looking then at the shadow shapes. And the shadow shapes, for the most part, are just fills. They're fills behind these. So Now this is going to be wet and then it bleeds. You could do this hard edge, or you could do this. This is the beauty of watercolor. You can backfill some of this. And not only does it create a shadow side, but it also creates another layer of one set of boughs behind the other. I'm doing this quickly and without much thought. Okay, I've kind of got these two types of trees colliding here, but you'll get the point. You can leave some sky holes. You know, this is something that, you know, you really should practice. And just, even if you really like doing this, just, this is worth learning. Just put that out of your mind for a while and try this, you know, when you get to sit down and do your practice. Now this is a real extreme contrast, but it's meant to show you, you know, how all of these values have shapes. You're going to keep hearing me repeat that. Now, some of you may remember back to a live episode I did to kick off this year, and it said I wanted to do more teaching involving understanding versus recreating. Understanding what it is you're painting. So when you recreate something, when you use a photo, you want to understand it. And this is from a recreation standpoint. So when you're putting pigment and drawing, putting all that down on your paper, you're understanding why you did it, rather than just verbatim copying what you see on your photo. Alright, so a question I get and comment I get a lot is I really have a hard time. I really have a hard time visualizing the shapes and the values and the way to simplify that. So let's look at what I mentioned. Squinting. Here's an exercise. This is probably good for you newbies. Oops, hit the camera. We're gonna play. Let's see how many times I can smack the camera today. So I took a picture of this tree. This is an apple tree, and the contrast was so low, I just took a Sharpie and outlined the tree so you can see it better. A little bit of glare. If I can prop something under there to try that. So what I want to do is this little exercise that shows you what it is I'm looking at. Just take a piece of ordinary tracing paper. And notice when I put the tracing paper over there, I've already cut some of the detail. So the contrast and the detail is not as evident, so that helps a little bit. Then take a marker. I've got this is just a Koi watercolor gray marker. And again, this, you know, those of you who draw and paint trees more frequently, you're probably not going to do this. what I end up doing here in this exercise is something I eventually do just in my head as I paint and draw. But first, you know, get a nice outer shape for the tree. That's easy. Okay. It's just what you want to start being able to do sight-wise. And you'll notice as we do this exercise, you're not going to see me stipple at all, but I'll get to that more. Now, I take the highlights and start surrounding those, and this is what you end up with. Okay. This is where you have to decide a little bit, because dark values and light values tend to mingle a little bit. And I'll show you how you deal with that. But just roughly find an edge of the highlights. What you're doing is you're studying the value pattern of the tree. You can study the value pattern of a face, of an animal, of a flower, of a still life, of fruit. You can do that with anything. In some places, you know, it gets a little difficult to decide, but it doesn't have to be, you know, picture perfect. We're watercolor artists. If we want a picture perfect, we just grab our camera and go out there and take a photograph. But you want to represent life and light. My favorite thing I think about painting and drawing anything is light and the way it falls on forms. And so this is just really fun. So what you end up with is something like that, and that's confusing, but that's your highlight value pattern. And so if I were painting a tree, I would go and I would paint that. I would paint those shapes. Then I would go back in and backfill. And shadow shapes. I'm doing this very roughly. Is this clear as mud so far? Anybody have any questions at this point about what I'm doing here? Okay, good. Now if I lift that up, you can kind of see I might all right. So now I have sort of a value study that I did of that tree. And you can go back, you know, and revise that. If you know, this is where the art part comes in. You know, fill in. You say, oh, there should be more shadow on this side. Now let's get back to the stippling for a minute. There is a place for it, and depending on how detailed you like your trees, I'm going to show you some examples from other artists here in a minute on how they handle it. But depending on how detailed you like your trees, there's a place for it. Now this is, I think, a key principle too. The first being, find the value shapes. Look for shapes that you can define. Overall shape of the tree, shape of interior structure, mainly the values, the highlights to begin with. The other thing is detail. When you want to do a detailed tree, detail is by the eye. The eye mostly sees detail on the edges. So as you're putting in these value shapes, and this is, I think, primarily, I mean, it applies to a lot of things, but especially applies to foliage, you know, brush, trees, grasses, that sort of thing, where there's kind of, find the contrast area. And that's where you're going to see the detail. So usually what I do, once I've defined these highlight shapes and I've gone back and I've filled, is I start adding a little bit of stippling around the edges. And see what happens. And so far I haven't spent all kinds of time stippling stuff in. And you want it darker on this edge, maybe there's more encroachment of these dark values. Don't go through and stipple the fool out of every square inch of this, just around the edges where the contrast is. We're going to actually take this information and paint this tree in a minute with real watercolor. With real, authentic watercolor. Yes, children, you too can be a watercolor painter. But you see what I'm doing. I add a little bit of stippling, and notice all of a sudden your eye thinks there's all kind of detail in that tree. And now this is outlined, and you don't normally outline it if you're painting. That would be a painted shape. What do I do with my card? Lost my card. Let's get another one. So I don't want to confuse you. What I'm showing here is an outline. I'm not actually suggesting, I mean, I am for this tracing paper exercise, but when you're actually painting, I'm not suggesting you draw an outline. I'm suggesting that that is a shape. That is a light shape and this is a dark shape. So you can go back later and just dot, again, keeping it towards the edge. Dot and stipple. You have to be careful though, because that's one of those areas where you can get detail drunk. A lot of you are familiar with my theory on detail drunk, being detail drunk. I've been detail drunk so many times. So, to reiterate, when I'm outlining these highlight shapes, I'm actually talking about painting a highlight shape and then going back. But for the purposes of the tracing paper exercise, yes, I actually turned it into an outline. Question: would printing a grayscale be as effective, or is this a method to help train your brain? Did you mean painting a grayscale? Yeah, I mean, you could do this exercise. If I understand your question, you could do this exercise purely as a grayscale if you want. Having a printed out grayscale is not really going to help you because you know, what are you trying to match, I guess is what I'm thinking. But there is a hierarchy of value, and there is a gray scale within any particular subject. Just looking here at the chat. Question: I'm a newbie. Would he recommend this tracing method with colored water markers or only gray? I would start with just gray. Or it could be black. I like gray because it's not quite as stark. Because what you're doing is you're studying value. You're studying the value pattern. You're not studying color. You can apply this later to color, but it's useful a lot of times to take your brain out of the color making decision. And color a lot of times gives you another area that you have to think about, another area you have to make decisions if you're new. And sometimes color will not help you judge values accurately. So to begin with, I would, if you're very new to painting trees, I would definitely do the tracing paper exercise with a gray marker. It could be pencil. It could be you could do this in pencil. The marker lets you do it quick. You just want to quickly study how the values break down on a tree. All right, trying to catch up here on the chat. Question: how do you paint trees grouped together? Well, it's the same way. I mean, really all you're doing is you're seeing sections of trees. All these trees, let's go back to my overall very confusing landscape here. All of these trees have a shape. Now you can see this one because it's in the foreground. But this is where we get into where I was talking about the interior structures. I mean, right here you can see a very definite couple of value patterns. Because watercolor is transparent, that's the reason I paint those first. Now there are different approaches to doing that. Some people, some very experienced watercolorists, would probably paint this whole thing with a lighter value and then go in a negative paint maybe while it's wet to get soft. But your eye has to be pretty good, pretty experienced to do that. I tend to think it's easier to start with to do it sort of in a paint by number fashion, which is kind of what this approximates. By the way, paint by number, if any of you did that as kids, or maybe you did it as adults, I don't care. That's all they do. They're breaking down values and then adding color to it. But back to the question, there are shapes, and it's true, not every tree fits into a perfect shape. There are a lot of irregularly shaped trees. But usually they crown out in some way, and their boughs, even in distinct areas, form particular shapes. And that's where I got into the internal structures, like umbrellas. Most often I see umbrellas. We have a lot of hardwoods where I live. That's a hickory. There's a big oak right there. There are some pine trees, but hardwoods like hickories and oaks, the highlight value patterns I usually see kind of look like a series of different size umbrellas. So I mean, if it's helpful, you know, go in and see what's the shape of that tree if I could see the whole tree. Obviously you can't, and in this case, you know, this little scrub pine here is growing out because there's no light back in here. So if you did have the whole tree, you know, you can kind of imagine what it is, but you can see enough of its boughs. And this tree back here, since this is in our yard, I know that it has a lot of dead limbs, so it's very irregular shape. And the oak trees, you will get oak trees that are very irregular in shape. This hickory, if you could get back far enough, you would see that it's got an overall bullet shape, kind of like that. So very tall, and they get very tall. But you're not seeing all of it. And of course, you know, you have gaps in them because they are growing next to other trees. I hope that kind of answers, yeah, you're basically just overlapping these shapes. You know, tree shapes, overall tree shapes are important when you start doing a tree like this, maybe out in the field with a meadow and a nice fence. Then they become more important. The overall tree shape is not as important when you're doing a complex scene like this. We'll go back and look at this one, which had that sort of, I don't know what kind of tree that is, but it's actually across the street from my house. It's got that almost triangular shape. And you can imagine, you know, another tree, there was a massive oak tree over here. Another tree may overlap that, so you know, it's just a visual game. But the more you study shapes, and this little apple tree is very traditionally shaped, you know, what people think of as a tree. This one has a lot of the finger shapes in it. You see where you see the tops of trees, like these are oaks back here. You can see they're tall. And here's a more spread out one. All right, just glancing at the chat here real quick. Bob Ross used to say you cannot make mistakes while painting happy trees. That's true. You know, he always used to say, in the end, it's your world. You make it look the way you want to make it look. But I know, you know, a lot of you, like me, you want to make something look like what everybody's going to recognize and say, oh yeah, that's a proper tree right there. I love it. Okay. Oh, and another point about all this is when you're doing this, let me get this one I did with the tracing paper. Oh, upside down. No wonder it wouldn't fit. I'm talking about watercolor, obviously. So one of the things you do when you paint, the stippling approach that I mentioned, I keep losing my sample cards that I was painting on. One of the things, obviously, is you want to paint to the strengths of the medium. So the dot stippling, that works great with oils. Yeah, I'm just going to put it back in here again, because you can go back, you know, and you can add darker values, you can add lighter values and cover up the darker values, and you can model it ad infinitum. That's fancy talk for forever, until you get the form and the shape that you want. That's what makes oil so forgiving. You don't have that option unless you're using wash. You don't have that option in watercolor. So and not only that, but painting shapes, distinct shapes, discrete shapes, is just a real strength of watercolor. It allows you to do so much. I mean, you could paint, I'm painting with a round, but I've seen just some beautiful trees painted with flats, and they get these interesting, interpretive, you know, kind of, you dab in color, let all that loose and loose, wet happen within those shapes. So it's one reason, if you're a watercolorist, you really want to kind of get into this value shape frame of mind. A lot of times when I paint a bow like that, I'll go back and lift while it's wet. And I can't go in like I can't with oils and start dotting in all of these little highlights, but I can make a really cool flowy shape that makes watercolor sing. It you know, I used to say a lot in a lot of my videos, you partner with the medium. You let watercolor join with you in the process and do what it does best, and you facilitate that process. So I think it's beautiful to me to see that kind of thing going on in a tree, and you can't do that as much when you're going dum 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 dum. But now towards the edge, you know, yeah, I'll dot in a stipple or two. And all of a sudden my eye sees that as a much more detailed branch. Now this is not dry, but if it were, I could do a couple here and there in the shadow areas. Alright, just glancing over. Love your videos. Thank you very much, Paul from Indiana. Okay, good. Glad you like the paper, tracing paper trick. Question: your cover painting for this video shows a tree with some detail and some blur. The whole painting has loose and tight elements. How do you decide that before you begin? Yeah, I would actually go pull that painting out if I had it, but I gave that to my daughter. It was one of her favorite paintings. That was a spontaneous painting. What I did is I just started splashing in paint. And if, most of you have seen my spontaneous landscapes, or just start painting stuff, and then I look to see what kind of a picture I see in it. So in that one I didn't really decide, but where I saw contrast and where I saw shapes. Oh wow, is this a super chat? Thank you. Thanks, Val. How do I put it? Yeah, spontaneous painting kind of is something different, and because by the way, it's a great way to practice this. If you already have some experience with value shapes, um, you'll start to see them. You start to see them everywhere. And when I'm driving down the road, I'll look at trees along the side of the road, and I start looking at the value shape. What shape does that make? What shape does this make? And that's what I did in that painting. You know, you can increase that contrast by lifting a little bit on the highlight edge, by painting along the darker part of the contrast edge, and increasing the contrast by, you know, adding extra areas to say, well, that looks like a start of something, so I'm going to turn that into, you know, a clump of grass, a rock. So yeah, a little bit different approach on that, but it still boils down to the same thing, and that is seeing the shape of values. Very good point, Mariah. Having a highlight shape at the start of your subject better ensures that the highlight will stay after you start putting in the lower lights. And you rephrased what I said excellently. You have to paint to the strengths of the medium, and it is a transparent medium. Unless you're going to use gouache, you've got to protect those highlights, which is exactly why I paint those first. Let me pull out the plein air piece I did. A lot of you probably saw this video a few weeks ago. This is a pine tree. And to Mariah's point, this is exactly what I did. I was on location out in my yard. I have this big grand short needle pine here, and I started painting this first. These here, and I just worked my way up, and then I started weaving this in, and I knew where this wanted to be. Now some people can actually paint all of the foliage light and then go back in and negative paint this. I find it easier just to backfill and leave an edge to let myself know where I need to fill. But these darker values were further layers behind other layers, and they were also shadow sides underneath. And then you can kind of see where I dotted in on the edge. And at first glance it might look like I stippled all that foliage in, but I didn't stipple any of it in. I just added a few dots along the edges of contrast. Hey Mark, didn't realize you were in here. How you doing, man? So yeah, that illustrates Mariah's point. She just well rephrased what I said. Question: could you colorize a grayscale underpainting using glazing to achieve interesting trees? Yes. Yes, that's a really neat technique actually, and I haven't done a lot of those. I need to make a video where I actually do that. You can, and it has a slightly different look, but if you're not concerned about like incredibly vibrant painting, yeah. And usually when we're painting trees and landscape like this, it works really well. You could do that in pencil too. I mean, you could do the underpainting. You know, Hajra Meeks, y'all probably remember when I had her live doing a meet. Hajra, she has a great video on grisaille, and that's sort of the academic term for underpainting. As an illustrator, we always just called it underpainting. We did it a lot with airbrush. Works very well with oil. Oil painters do it almost religiously, a lot of them, but it does work with watercolor. And you want to keep it kind of in the temperature, you know, if it's a very warm, you know, you can do sort of a sepia painting and keep it light, and you can glaze in your values on top. So yeah. Question: have you ever painted dark to light? Yeah, not as much with watercolor, since it's traditionally a light to dark medium. I'm trying to think off the top of my head specific. Glazing. A lot of times when I'm gonna do a painting, faces, I often do faces dark to light, but not, I mean, it's still light to dark in that I don't do the full depth of the shadow first. I'll start in the dark areas and blend it out, and then build that value down until I get it as dark as I need. So I guess it's kind of half of one and half of another. The brush I'm using is a number 10 round. Great brush, silver black velvet. So hold on just a second. All right, wow, another hour has already gone by. I just cannot believe that. Let's paint this tree, and I've got my tracing paper value study here, and again, eventually you will be able to do this out of your head. You'll start seeing these values, but it's a great way to train your eye. And some of this is probably not going to work the way I would normally do it, because I would dry some parts and then come back, but we'll just go with it. We'll just go with it. And, you know, go back and just recall my comments about stippling, and just watch how little I actually do that. And I'm not laboriously following those shapes, but I am following the pattern more or less. And a lot of times I'll do that. You know, one of the things you want to get to do is understand the value patterns that you see, and say, here's what they do, and I can be inventive with them. I can create my own set of value patterns, and that's when you really start experiencing some exciting, you know, advances in your tree painting. Now, in my photo, there was a lot of value, and this is, you know, again, me talking through how I edit the photo. There was a lot of excessive shadow in the center, and I don't particularly like that or want that much. So it's my art, I can do what I want with it. But I understand how the shadow patterns are working. So I'm going to design a highlight pattern that's more or less like this. Okay. This is azo green, mainly nickel azo yellow mixed with azo green. Two of my favorite foliage colors. And one color that shadows really well with these is Prussian blue. And I can start Adding that in. I will also add some Payne's gray to that, depending on how dark I want it. And you know, I'm using those highlight shapes as a guide for where to add these deep value shapes. If I'm getting repetitive, I'm sorry, but this is really just a powerful way to look at subjects, particularly trees. You know, and you can bring those shapes down, kind of echo some of these shapes, because there'll be a layer, sometimes there'll be a layer of leaves behind the others that are in shade and shadow. Dabbing in some Payne's gray here where I want it really dark. You know, and later when this dries, you can say, well, those highlights there, those highlight shapes are too light. You can always go darker. It's much more difficult to go lighter in watercolor, but you know, as has been pointed out, I've preserved the highlights. Alright, I'm going to just pop in a trunk here so we can complete the ensemble. And then bring those trunks up into those, and that kind of pushes that shadow layer back. This is sepia. There's maybe a little neutral tint I'm throwing in there. And then start doing whatever you want with these. That's not dry enough for a crisp branch up in there yet. But you can see where I'm going with this. Alright, question. I see you going from light straight into shadows. How can you add the mid-tone without muddying the painting? Well, some of the midtones have been created automatically, and a lot of times I'll glaze those in a little later. There is a lot of contrast in this tree, so I won't have a lot of midtones, but as a matter of fact, I was getting ready to, and some of this is still wet, so I can pull out glazes. Let's say my light source is coming this way, which I think actually it is in the photo. So more of these shapes are going to be in shadow, and there's going to be more areas between the shade and the light. And since that paint is still wet, but to specifically answer your question about the muddying, I wouldn't do it till it's dry. I wouldn't glaze unless I'm able to pull out. If I went in now with very wet washes, because that's in the danger zone, that's in the zone of drying where if I used a lot of water or a lot of wet wash, it would back run. So anything I add to this now, which is still damp, needs to be primarily pigment with very little water. So yeah, I'd wait till it dries. If I wanted to add midtones, I would glaze them in. I want this to be fairly high contrast, so I'm not going to add a lot. But while it's damp, I can dry brush up some of these lower values. And my brush is it's still damp, but it's very dry. I'm doing that because I don't want to create a background. I want this to dry because I want to get to that stipple stage again and just reiterate that and how that works. I'm just glancing at the chat real quick while I'm waiting on this to dry. Question: have you ever used cold wax medium to varnish watercolor paper? No, I haven't. I know a lot of people use that. I have a UV spray sealer that has a UV inhibiting component in it. I use that to fix the watercolor if I'm going to varnish it, and then I use I don't know if I have it handy or not. Then I use an acrylic varnish on top of that. There it is. So after I've fixed my painting with a UV spray, it's a Krylon, I think, UV spray. Seal it real good and fix it. Then I put a coat of this on, which this is gel top coat. It's like a varnish. It's golden, obviously, and it's also got a UV component in it. I don't varnish anything that's going to go matted under glass. I will use UV glass, but this I'll only do this for like maybe watercolor canvas or things that might get mounted. Watercolor paper that's going to get mounted on a gallery wrap. So, good question. Another question: how do you approach painting something more colorful like fruit trees? Does your technique change? I would probably mask the fruit if they were really bright. You know, that would also apply to excuse me, that would also apply to blooming trees. I would probably mask them, and then I would go through the same process, and that way you can go back in. And another way is gouache. That's perfectly normal. I've seen a lot of fruit trees where they add the fruit with gouache. So this is almost dry enough. I think I'll just now again, getting back to the final stage and bringing and again, this is style based. I realize this. If you're an advanced painter and you have your own method for stippling, that's fine. So this is my method. But this is where I think you bring stippling in at the proper time, and that's at the end, once you've established your shapes, your forms, and your value patterns. And I'll just add some, keeping them to the edge. These are darker, but they'll dry lighter. So the light ones. And that could be a sky back there. Now obviously, if that's a dark background, I couldn't do this unless I had masked it. Couldn't do it with the light paint, but I can here. And I mean, just notice how little stippling I'm doing. And when I'm done, it'll look like I did a whole bunch. That's because that's the way your eye picks up and perceives detail. And see that already, that tree looks 10 times more detailed than it did, and I only had a little. So I'm going to mix some Prussian blue with some Payne's gray, and we're going to come in here, and where these values contrast, the edges that they form, and they contrast, that's a little too wet. Just going to add a little bit. Again, don't get detail drunk in this phase. I say it because I've done it 1,000 times. It just gets fun. I mean, when you start adding these details and you go, oh, that looks so great. And so you go, if that looked great, then 3 times as much of that will look even greater. Sorry, it didn't work that way. Then you start getting the overwork territory. There. So just that little bit of stippling, and already it looks much more detailed. All I did was add a few leaves on the edges of the dark values where the contrast is, and the edges of the light. You know, and once you get good at drawing and planning these, if you want to, you can actually mask out some of these edge details and paint around it, and when you come in and paint all your shapes, you lift that mask and you'll have a few edge highlights if you want. So just really fun, and not the only way to paint trees. And I'm going to show you some artist examples here in a minute that I downloaded from my Pinterest. I save examples all the time from Pinterest, and you know, examples that remind me of how simple things can get. That's one thing I look, just, you know, incredibly beautiful examples of watercolor is another thing I look for. But one of the things I do look for is just poetically simple and masterfully simple and easy strokes. And it looks easy, but it's not. Let me see. Question: does it matter with watercoloring if you use a heat gun or blow dryer? I don't think so. I don't have a heat gun. I use a blow dryer. I've used it on low and on high. I don't know. That's usually not hot enough, or that's usually not too hot that I can't put my hand under it. You know, the heat guns get more concentrated. I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's fine as long as you keep it moving. So yeah, I don't think it's a problem. Question: have you ever used coal wax medium to varnish? I think I already answered that question. No, and the answer is no. I've never used varnish, coal wax varnish. I use acrylic spray and to fix it, and then I use a gel top coat, both UV inhibitors. Plastic coffee stirrers are great for applying masking fluid. Yeah, I bet they are. I use them to stir with. Yep, detergent your brushes. Exactly right. And use cheap brushes for masking fluid. Question: I've been using inexpensive watercolors for a while, Van Goghs. I used to have a lot of Van Gogh. I probably still do in a drawer. Which brand would you suggest I move to when buying artist's grade watercolor? Oh, that's the $60 million question. Most of the top brands are good. What I would rate as the top brands are Daniel Smith, M. Graham, Da Vinci. I know I'm leaving some out. Winsor Newton, What else? Denise, help me out here. You're like the queen of pigments out there. Um, if they're artist grade, they're usually pretty good. I really like Mission Gold, though some people are still suspicious of it. Core, um, all of those brands are fine. My favorite is M. Graham. It has been. Now, one thing I always like to say is I picked M. Graham for certain qualities that may not mean anything to you. I like the fact that they don't dry hard. Some people complain that they get goopy. I've never had that happen. Never. Not even once. Mine dry to a hard, tacky but tar-like consistency. And that's always been fine. I've never had them run in a palette, but I hear all kinds of stories. People say they run when they put them in a palette and you can't take them in plein air. And usually when I fill a palette with M. Graham, I'll let it sit out for at least a day, maybe a couple days, and it sets up not rock hard, but it sets up tacky hard. Kind of like dried gum. How chewing gum can you can still mash it and form it, but it's pretty stiff. That's usually, and it has honey. Honey is not the binder. No, honey is a humectant. Is that right? It's a preservative, and it also is used to affect flow. It also makes the paints re-wet really fast. They use a standard binder. They use gum arabic, but they do add honey. Honey, usually you won't have any trouble with mold. At least I never have. I've never had it paints mold because I usually make sure they're dry before I seal up the palette. But yeah, honey is not the binder. Honey is an additive. Mission Gold uses it too. So does Sennelier. And you'll find that all of those paints re-wet incredibly fast, almost like you're painting right out of the top of the tube. That's what I like about it. And they are, M. Graham is meticulous. For one thing, they're very environmentally friendly. All their processes are very environmentally friendly. Excuse me. They're very meticulous about where they buy their pigments. So they don't buy pigments all from one pigment vendor like some paint companies will. They'll shop for the best in a particular color according to their preference. And I've actually met Art Graham and listened to one of his lectures, and just not a question he can't field on pigments, and I've just always been impressed. Doesn't mean that there aren't other colors, and in fact I'm probably gonna be putting together a Daniel Smith palette soon. I've been collecting a few here and there, and I still have to decide on the last few colors to go in it. I love them. I love Core. I love Mission Gold. I have Schminke. Oh, that's another one. I don't think I mentioned Schminke. Schminke and Sennelier both have a little more opacity. I feel like get a little more transparency out of M. Graham. So they're all good. It's just kind of gets down to what you plan to paint and how you like to paint, and what qualities you like in a paint. So you may have to actually gain a lot of experience, and until then, just if you're going to upgrade to availability, that's a good one. I like to just be able to run down to my art store, and they carry M. Graham, and pick up a tube rather than having to order them all the time. So what else? We're probably going to need to wrap this up for almost an hour and a half. Let me show you some other artists examples of how they have treated value patterns. Love these. Absolutely love these. This is I think a Russian painter. I can't even pronounce his name, so I'm not going to try. I think I have some of his stuff saved in my Pinterest. Just look at these. So simple and yet so beautiful. You know, here, back here, this whole tree area is in shadow, so you don't have a lot of contrasting value patterns. So in cases like that, you know, it's pretty flat. But he went in and just, you know, there's a little violet here, there's a little what looks, you know, more phthalo or Prussian up here. I see some green bleeding in, and it's all flat in terms of value, but interest. You can't do that with oils, folks. You can't do that with oils. Now, don't get me wrong, I love oils for different reasons, but look at these simple shapes. All of these are solid. Pay careful attention to that. Where do you see the stipple detail? A little bit here, a little bit on the edges. Same down here. This is basically a solid shape. And he doesn't have a lot of strong light value contrast here, creating shadow shapes. But still, it's masterful. Masterful. Same over here. Just love what he's done. When you start looking at the interior structures, and he was looking at trees. I mean, that's a tree he met. I like to say it that way. Go out and meet a tree, because they have personalities and characteristics. This is a tree this guy met. Maybe he did it plein air, maybe he did it from a photo. But try to paint something like that out of your head, unless you've had years of experience painting trees, and you're probably not going to do it. So, irregular, it's not an overall shape. Bare towards the top, really neat color contrast between here and the background. And all of this in here is solid, but stippled in a few extra leaves on the edge, and now your eye thinks there's all kind of detail in that foliage canopy or in those foliage structures. This stuff just excites me, which is why I save this stuff on Pinterest. Let's look at another one. This is an artist by the name of Ian Sidway on the left. There's a little more detail in this, but look at it carefully. Where do you see all the detail? It's mainly in the sky holes. And he had a light sky, so he was able to do a lot of that. You look at the interior structure, it's mostly solid, so he's paid a lot of attention to the forms, the value shapes and the forms. But overall, his tree has got incredible value, structure, and form. And you get down in here, and he's rolled those values under to create some volume. He's created layers, so that tree looks like it's going, you know, it looks like you've got here and then you've got back there. And he's added his leaf detail around the edges. Just incredible. Here, contrasted as an extremely loose example. Now this is, I included this, just, it is so loose, but just as an example of how you can take a complex, and this part was covered in trees, just overarching, you know, the walkway. But they painted mostly solid, and where they changed value here, they just kind of slapped in a little bit of foliage. This is looser than I normally paint, but here, just another idea for those of you who might like to paint really loose. Question, can you zoom in on these pics? I can't. It's a fixed, quite well, I have a fixed focus right now. Because if I do that, it's going to, if I do this, I don't know which one you wanted to see. If I do, is that out of focus? This tree over here, I don't know who painted that. Sometimes I try to find the names and I can't. On Pinterest, it's sometimes difficult to do. They don't link. Sometimes they just link to another pen. Let's look at one last set of examples. You can see how same principle, but yet totally different look. Look at these fir trees here. Those are solid shapes, but I mean, I can count right here: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 little stipples, just to bring your eye in and feel like there's detail. Same here with these shapes, almost as solid. Here in these darker value shapes, but where the edge contrasts, just a few little choice stipples. Same here in these pine trees. This is a little different in that they use spatter. So they've got a whole value structure, and this looks like it's very front lit. So looks like light streaming through the trees, and I don't know who either of these painters are. They added that light on the ground, so the light is like coming in. But they probably just took a brush for this spatter, and they didn't overdo it. That's another one that's really easy to overdo. You know, my teacher, one of my watercolor teachers, used to flick it off their finger. I used to do it that way. Usually what I do now is tap on the handle of another brush, and they did just add a little bit of spatter that way. But they created all of their structure and their form with solid shapes. Okay. Question: Steve, have you spoken much about reflections of trees and water, and how you might advise handling those? I haven't. I need to do. I actually was planning on doing an episode about reflections. You know, most of the time when I paint a reflection, I paint a soft reflection. So let's say this is a bank, an embankment. We're just going to do a nondescript kind of a shape on the bank. You know, what's cool in photographs are mirror images, and I think that's a really neat thing when a photographer gets water that's so still that it's. But I don't do that, me personally, I don't do that much in terms of reflection. If you want to get that meticulous, you know, you're going to have to probably mirror your image. What I do, however, is I like the streak. I like the, yeah, and you can even touch these while you're still wet. Usually by the time you get back to doing that, it's already dry. But you can even go back over this embankment with a glaze. But if it's still wet, you know, you can touch. And what I'll even do is tilt that up so that those bleed down. And if you don't match, you know, what's on the bank exactly, it's not a big deal. And a lot of times if there's a breeze blowing across the water, you'll have this kind of stuff. And I would paint it in there, it was just going to bleed. So the image starts to break up. You know, you've all seen this. The ripples. And that's a poor example, but I may go in. Here I've got a bone dry brush. Maybe try to add a streak across. That's not picking up much paint. Sometimes you can actually use a tissue as a brush. Didn't really put a lot of color in there, did I? So that's like the quick and dirty, simple reflection. Sometimes you can twist the tissue. I do this a lot with clouds. Well, it's not really doing it, but failing that, what I would do is just wait till it's dry and get a scrubber brush and maybe just lift a highlight or two across that water. You'll even get some, again, it's probably going to bleed right now, but you'll even get some darker streaks across the water. Those are important because you want to get the idea that there's reflection, but you also want to get the idea that there's a plane here. So I hope that made sense. Now reflections are fun. We're going to start wrapping this up, so I'll take any final questions you might have. Okay, good. Thanks, Mark. I'm glad that made some sense. And when it's coming out of your mouth, sometimes it feels like gibberish. Dum-de-dum-de-dum. Yep, it's called a strong horizontal. That's exactly right. And it kind of helps your eye pick up another plane. So you see a reflection in depth, but you also see a plane. Question, Steve. Have you used your Arches book yet? Are you the one, Barbara, that pinged me on Facebook for that? I've got, the reason I'm asking is I've got several Arches books now. I've actually got, okay, I forget who the name was. It's somebody on Facebook, on my Facebook page. Oh, you are? Okay, great. Let me show you that. I mean, you put it perfectly, Barbara. That is a unicorn. Oh, I'm just throwing things all over the studio. You guys want to see a unicorn of the watercolor world? Ah! A hardbound Arches field book. And Barbara turned me on to this. They had like 3 of them, didn't they, Barbara, or something like that? I think when I ordered there was like 3 of them on, what was it, Amazon? Yeah. And we thought, what is this? Are they going to start making these? And no, what best we can, they're not making these, I wish, anymore. Best we could tell, and maybe somebody out there watching now knows exactly what this is. Best we could tell, this was new old stock that somebody was selling. And look at those embossed, the embossing on this stuff. Yeah, when Barbara kind of pinged me on Facebook about this, I almost fell over myself trying to get to Amazon quickly to buy one. This is a Arches 20 sheet travel edition hardbound sketchbook. I just hear angels singing right now. Did you guys hear it? Yeah. And now I'm sad that I didn't order all 3 that they had left. So unless somebody can tell, from all I can tell, nobody is selling these now. All I can tell is that this was new old stock that somebody had. I thought that I saw something that indicated that the seller was sort of like a picker. You guys know what a picker is? And so this was probably some stock that some craft store or something was clearing out. Anyway, Barbara, thank you. Thank you so much. I haven't used it yet. I'm afraid to, I'm almost, you know, she and I joked on Facebook. I wanted to put it under glass, put spotlights on it, and a rotating turntable, never to be used. I'm still considering it. Still considering it. Oh man. What else? Anybody else? Those books are terrible, Mark says. I think you need to send it to me, you know, just to get rid of it. I hear you, buddy. Yeah. I may never know, because I may never paint in it. Please film filling it. Anyway, yeah. You know, I probably will have to. I will have to paint in it, I guess. I'm getting to the point now where I collect watercolor paper and sketchbooks like some people collect wine. They probably have more than they'll ever drink. I need to build a walk-in closet or something. Let me get my face back up here. I need to build a watercolor paper and sketchbook cellar or something. How much was it? I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I think you're right, Barbara. It was like 40 to 45 bucks. But it's like, man, why don't they still make that? Why didn't anybody make that? I mean, you know, I went nuts when Irwin Leon had his perfect sketchbook, which now you can't get anymore. Yeah, Heather, you have a hard time bringing myself to use Precious Arts paper. I know what you're talking about. I can't really say I've ever been in that camp, because I had a watercolor teacher that started me off right. Basically, he said this is all you should ever use. So I've never used anything else as my staple. And, you know, whenever I tried cheap watercolor paper, it was always disappointing. So I never had that sort of precious kind of emotion with my paper, but I do understand it. I do understand budgets. I do understand not being able to get something that you'd like to get. Thank you, mods. Yes, thank you so much, Val, for being here. Thank you. Everybody, please check out Val's channel if you never have. Valerie Canal, Drawing with Fire. She is a pyrographer par excellence. She's even doing it. If you've never seen this, you got to watch it. She even does pyrography on watercolor paper, and she's starting to. I don't know if she's starting to. Maybe you've been doing it for years, but watercolor for finished pieces, and it's really neat. I mean, she's just an excellent renderer, and it's fascinating to watch. She does lives, I think, every week, right, Val? And she's always ready to come over here and help me mod on my channel, and she's probably one of the best mods out there. What would you recommend for a beginner who doesn't want to spend too much yet? Are you talking about paper? If you're talking about paper, all of my demos today have been done on B. This is B. I use this or Arches pads for my practice. Now that's 100% cotton. And I'm not going to get into the rant about non-cotton papers. There are some out there, and I just think it's harder to paint on them. But if you're committed to buying 100% cotton paper, this is a good one to start. Hobby Lobby sells these in packs, pre-cut to this size, 25 sheet pack. You can get a 50 sheet pack on Amazon really cheaply. I always get these at 40% off because I have a Hobby Lobby app, and so on any given day I can get 40% off. It's like makes it less than $10 for a sheet of 20 or a pack of 25. Question: have you used the Pentalic Aqua journal paper? Yes, I have. Let's see if I can grab it. And I'm glad you brought it up. It was one of my more favorite non-cotton sketchbooks. This is it. Yeah, it still had a lot of the drawbacks that pulp paper has, but for pulp paper, they didn't do too bad a job. So yeah, I liked this one. I also liked the handbook journal ones. I think I've got something in here. I did a video on this. It's pen and wash, and all of my non-cotton journals, my pulp paper journals, are going to go to pen and wash. I'm going to start using them for pen and wash. So I did a video on this. I didn't do a video on this. This is what I did while I was waiting on my daughter to get her teeth checked, and that's all I've done on this one. So yeah, as pulp papers go, not bad. Still not cotton. Yeah, it is Denise, it is really nice for not being cotton. Would sizing the surface of pulp paper with gelatin size resolve some of the issues? No. If anything, they need less sizing. They're usually you can't layer with pulp. That's the problem. And it's to varying degrees. But pulp paper and to varying degrees depending on brand. But pulp paper just does not layer. If you do a lot of alla prima painting, that's all your washes are put down at once, without a lot of glazing or layering. It's not so bad, and experienced painters I've seen use it very effectively. But sizing I don't think is the problem. It just doesn't manage moisture the way cotton does, and so when you go to put down future layers, the underlying layers just lift up, and you don't have a glaze anymore. You have a muddy mix, or a mix. So yeah. I've never used white nights. There are a number of other channels. I think Denise, you have done a review on those, haven't you? I know some other channels have. Marty Ewings probably has too. I think Lindsay Wyrick, I think, has done a review on it. All right, well, we're getting close to 2 hours here. I'm gonna sign off. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. Really appreciate it. This is always just fun. I hope you got something out of it today, and y'all are the best. By way of an announcement, if any of you are patrons, I'm going to start doing more regular streaming to patrons only, so look for that in the future. I don't know when that'll be, but it will start to become some of the extra video content that I've been uploading there. Hopefully it'll allow me to do more, longer, and provide interaction like I do here, but with patrons. So it'll be a little more intimate, as there'll be less people watching, and I'll be able to do more lengthy discussions with you, hopefully. So look for that. Thanks, everybody. Thanks again, Val. Thanks to some of you other guys for coming in and supporting me. Thanks, Denise, for showing up. Mark, appreciate it. And we are going to go and see you guys in another video.